All right, so in this video, I want to talk with you all about topic selection, which is probably one of the concepts that is most difficult for students in a composition course, but also in other courses. I'm going to use for this video an example of essay prompts that I have written based on requirements at McNeese State University for a Composition 2 class. However, many of the things I discuss in this video will still be applicable to students at other institutions who are trying to select topics and think about how to develop a research project, a semester-long research project. So one of the challenges with topic selection, I think, is interest. And students often tell me I can only write what I'm interested in. And this sort of mindset presents a very difficult obstacle for students to overcome in their writing. Because one of the things you need to be able to do as a college level writer is to write or discuss things that you might not be interested in. And in reality, any sort of professional will encounter on a day-to-day basis topics and issues and attributes of the work that they do that frankly is not super pleasant, right? Or that doesn't really spark their inspiration. And they will have to write and discuss things that they might find boring from time to time. So developing this skill and learning how to do this is actually going to be very useful and something that can be transferred. It has transferability across multiple disciplines. So the first thing I want all of you to do is stop thinking that you can only write about topics that interest you. For example, in the composition class that I'm teaching and using as an example for this video, students have to read an assigned reader, which is determined by the college and by the professor. In this reader, the reader that's selected for this section, the main topic of the reader is happiness, how it's defined, what it means in our culture, and in relationship to other attributes and other concepts we can think of. So the students are required by this course to develop a narrowed topic that is rooted in this text. This text that's main topic is happiness. You may be in a history course, for example, and be asked to write a paper about the concept of capitalism in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which is a famous book that set forward the idea of basically contemporary capitalism and free markets and free trade. So you may have no interest in that whatsoever, but the class requires you developing a topic that is based on that book. So you're going to have to figure out something about it that interests you. And you're going to have to figure out a way to talk about it even if it doesn't interest you. So the next thing I want you to think about with topic selection is you must read the assigned materials. A lot of students try to skip out on this in all their courses. In high school courses, my experience when I was a high school teacher was that students would often be assigned a reading, but then the teacher would give them some sort of study guide, and I've actually been guilty of this as well. And the study guide would, rather than supplement the reading and support the reading and expand upon it, would actually just pretty much summarize all the main ideas that the teacher wanted the student to develop from the reading. So the students wouldn't read because, of course, they're super busy. they would just skim the study guide, and they really didn't think at all about the topic or the reading selection that had been signed. They just skimmed the study guide to look for the answers that are going to be on the test, and inevitably, the study guide was almost an exact mirror of the test. Now, this is great for your bottom line with scores and standardized tests, but this doesn't teach you how to think, and it doesn't teach you how to analyze and contemplate the things that you have read, which is a big part of what writing does. Writing is often a way for us to work through our thoughts and our experiences from the things we read and the things we are told and the things that we hear and the things that we see, and figure out how all these things together make meaning. So in a college level class, your first step is, if there is a reading from which a topic is supposed to be derived, you must read the materials. And you can't just skip. You can't go to about.com or Cliff Notes or Spark Notes or Wikipedia or anything like that and get some sort of summary. You can't cheat on this. You have to actually do the hard work of reading. And as you are reading, you must read actively. And that's sort of a cliche way of saying, as you are reading, make connections to things you already know. Jot down notes. If you encounter an interesting quote, write that down. Have some sort of journal that you can jot things down. Later, you're going to, in my classes often, use something like that to develop a research journal, which I've already done a video on how to set up the format for that. But you can start by just having a notebook, just like a pad and pencil, and jotting down things you encounter with the page numbers. Whatever you do, make your reading as active as possible and try to make connections. One of the ways we learn and grow is by connecting new knowledge to previous knowledge. So you must read the assigned materials. The next thing you must do is you must read the assignment prompt thoroughly and make sure you understand the task. So every class, again, this video is basically topic selection for any sort of essay writing. Any class that gives you a writing assignment is typically going to give you a prompt. For example, as I said, in this class, I'm using prompts that I've written for McNeese State University this semester, but many of these prompts are structured like any of my prompts. Every teacher writes prompts a little different and puts a little bit of different information in them. So you need to read and make sure you really understand what's in there. Now, one of the aspects too is being able to translate. Like I have my prompt up here right now for the research journal assignment, but to be able to translate what all this means, what exactly is the teacher asking you to do? So in here, I go to the prompt. Based on their reading, students will develop a research journal using a basic annotated bibliography structure as a template, but having a slightly different purpose. The research journal should be thought of as a document the student will use throughout the semester to document. Notice the two different ways those words are being used. That might confuse some readers, but words have different usages and definitions depending on context. Their research and make the construction of essays easier. Each entry for the research journal should be placed in alphabetical order and contain the following information: correctly formatted works cited entry, background information about the author or authors, and this information proves their credibility, a list of at least 5 correctly formatted quotations with proper parenthetical citations at the end of each quote, a sentence following each correctly formatted quote that explains how this quote reflects data that can be used to support a position in a future essay. So one of the things I want you to notice right off the bat about this prompt is nowhere in this prompt do I say what you are writing about. What I say here is based on their reading. So that goes back to my previous statement of making sure you've read the assigned materials. often, especially in advanced classes, junior and senior classes, you're going to have to develop a paper just based on the lectures that the faculty member gives and your notes from those lectures, and then go off and come up with an argument, and then support that argument with the research that you do. So based on your reading, you're going to create this document. Now, if we go a little further, for this particular class, I provided every single prompt for every single paper that the students will do. I have another prompt, and this is for a more traditional paper. This is the prospectus, which is an argument for their topic. The prospectus is a minimum 5-paragraph essay where the student must argue for the viability of their topic choice. The prospectus will prove to the reader that the student has a narrow topic. So there I've defined that I want this to be a narrow topic. So one of the things you can ask a faculty member is exactly what they mean by narrow topic when they use that term. Again, every faculty member is going to mean something a little different by this term, and has identified enough foundational sources to begin writing on the topic. So you know from these prompts and the prompts that you get that you have to develop a topic that's rooted in the reading. And then your topic needs to be something that you can research, that you can write about. So you must read the assignment prompt thoroughly and make sure you can understand the task. The next thing you can do is start brainstorming from the things you have read and the notes you have jotted down from that reading about potential ways of narrowing or discussing or developing a new topic. And one of the things I often do is I look for repetition. What I mean by this is if there are a lot of quotes that are talking about similar concepts from my notes, from a lecture. Look at that, I misspelled it. Thank the gods for spell check, right? Look for repetition. When I'm looking at my notes, I look for things that repeat. I look for ideas that pop back up, because that might be something that has heat to it, that's interesting. I had a creative writing teacher tell me once that we write about our obsessions, and I think that's even true in academic writing. So I know at first I said, you've got to be able to write about things that don't interest you. But what you might find is you're in a class and you think, oh, there's nothing in this class that's interesting. But if you go back to your notes, you can start to pick out a pattern of what is interesting. So if you take notes while you're reading, if you actively read, then you will find something interesting in those notes. Now, if you're one of those people who never writes anything down as you read, and reads a couple minutes and then gets on their phone and looks at social media or gets interrupted constantly, that's not focused active reading. You have to set aside time as a college student to read without distractions. At most you can have music playing, but really you need to find a space and a place and time where you can just read, even if it's just 15 minutes. And I know that is something that is not popular or easy in our contemporary world, but you need to find time where you can really just focus on the things you're reading and try to sustain your concentration. And if it's hard for you to do 15 minutes, do 10 minutes, take a break, and start building up your concentration as you go. Because like anything else, the sorts of reading that you're going to be asked to do and then translate into meaningful writing as you progress are going to get more difficult and more dense and have more layers and more subject-specific vocabulary. So start now in this freshman level or first year level course developing that reading concentration. Reading is really a key part to this. But look for repetition in your notes. Think about how the topic can be discussed. If aspects of the topic are self-evident, that means there isn't much to talk about. So the reason that is important is we don't want to have our thesis statement end up being a fact statement. Essays in composition classes and in most college classes are not encyclopedia entries. Essays are not encyclopedia entries. They are not just informative. You will be given assignments where you have to write informative papers, where the only thing you do is present information in as unbiased a way as possible. But most of the time, a term paper or an essay, you're going to be asked to take a position. So once you've developed some possible topics from looking at repetition and thinking about these things and jotting down some notes, the next thing to ask yourself, is this idea debatable? Are there arguments? And I cannot type today, y'all. Are there arguments? So go in, debatable. Because you're going to have to write a thesis statement. Thesis statements must be debatable. You're going to have to write a thesis statement. And a thesis statement is an opinion. Now, it's an opinion based on evidence and experience. But it's still an opinion, and that means there can be an opposing opinion. In this class in particular, in most of my Composition 2 papers, I have students write the last two main essays are one side of an argument and the opposing side of an argument. If you pick something that there's nothing to debate about, there's no evidence to the contrary for your position, then you've basically picked a topic that you can't write the last essay about, or the last two essays about. It's not very effective for you. So when you select this topic, it needs to be something that's debatable. So you need to ask yourself this question: is it debatable? Next, finally, start to do some preliminary research. Now, for some students, preliminary research is going to be really easy because, like the reader for this class that I'm talking about, and I used the prompts from as an example for this video, their reader has articles in there that already are academic or scholarly. So what that means is they're peer-reviewed, they're published in credible journals, journals that people go to get information. They're not just news outlets. Like I know all this stuff is bandied about all the time about fake news, and really it's debatable what is fake news and what isn't fake news. But the truth is that we have to think of our news outlets as primarily corporations who are concerned with their bottom line. Their primary concern is to increase advertising revenue. And the way they increase advertising revenue is by presenting us with the most sensational, most interesting, most dramatic news stories they can find. If they just posted good news and information all the time, nobody would watch it, because frankly, we are drawn to the macabre and to the violent. That's what our culture is based on. We're very similar to the Romans. And the sooner we come to terms with that, the sooner we can realize that we really can't take what is presented on any news channel, no matter what our political leanings are, as solid evidence. So typically when we're doing research, we get it from database articles. And even those database articles, the scholarly articles on databases, sometimes have problems. We have to look at basically where the money's coming from for the research before we make conclusions. But people who have access to those sorts of articles for their topics, it's a lot easier to do this preliminary research and to test their topic, because they can literally go to the reference page or the works cited page and find more sources and see if more sources exist. Some students will get readers that are novels, or they'll be in a literature class, or they'll be in a history class, and they have to go to primary sources. In that case, you can do a bit of online research, but again, you will have to apply. let's see if I can type. Well, in that preliminary research, be sure to apply information literacy skills. And what that means, and again, I'll do some other videos about this on my YouTube channel, information literacy refers to your ability to examine a source and see whether it is credible, and track down whether that source is coming from reliable individuals and reliable organization and presents data that is useful. And that's a skill that you develop over time. It goes back to my conversation previously about understanding, how news networks like Fox, MSNBC, and CNN give you information, but we have to remember that information is always tainted by the fact that they have to increase viewership so that they can increase advertising revenue, so they can keep their jobs. It's sort of like a doctor that's hired by a tobacco company presenting data that cigarettes aren't bad for you. Of course that doctor is going to skew toward data that is going to support the company that is paying for his salary and his livelihood. You always have to sort of follow the money when you are applying information literacy skills. And it sounds very cynical to put it that way, but it is an important skill to develop, because in our contemporary culture, people really accept things at face value way too easily. And I think that's because there's such a flood of information online that all of us use. And that's my rant on that now. That's really a separate topic and a separate video from topic selection, but it does play a part in topic selection. So I know this is a longer video, but there's a couple things I want to point out that you should avoid. Let me pull this all the way up. So things to avoid. So religious and spiritual arguments typically don't go anywhere, because these are things that are dealing with people's beliefs. And when you write an essay that is rooted in faith or beliefs, those things are not always, shall we say, logically based. And they shouldn't be. Religious and spiritual concepts and experiences are very rarely rational ones. And I know that some people find offense in that, but and the book in this class that I'm using as an example, they will talk about some religious things. They'll talk about Hinduism and Christianity and Buddhism and some of those philosophies. And that's why I say, if you're in a philosophical or theology or ethics course, you might have to talk about these things. But the approach in those contexts is very different than the approach in, say, a course like this, when you don't necessarily know what the beliefs of your professor are. And let's say you are an evangelical right-wing Christian and you are so dogmatically certain that the King James Bible is the final authority and word of God, and there should be no other translations of the Bible beyond that, and anybody else who believes anything different is going to burn in hell. Well, you can imagine, if you present that sort of worldview in an essay, how that's going to shut out everybody who doesn't believe that, which is a large portion of the population. People are welcome to have those beliefs, but those beliefs should not determine your arguments. And it's just better to avoid those things unless you're in a certain situation where you can talk about those things in a respectful and tolerant manner. If you find that it is very difficult for you to discuss issues of faith or philosophy or spirituality with others without getting easily offended, it's probably best if you just don't talk about them, don't use those topics. And also, on that note, it's also a good idea, unless you're using them in the same way you would use a literary source, using scripture from any sort of religion as factual evidence of supporting a position is usually frowned upon in college classes. All right, so another sort of thing to avoid are extremely divisive issues in politics. Again, one of the issues I find with students is they often try to write what they think I believe as a teacher. And they think by writing what I believe, it will improve their grade. Really, what I'm focused on is that their argument is based on evidence and credible evidence. Now, they may think their argument's based on credible evidence, but if they're just quoting one side of an issue, or they're just quoting what their grandfather or uncles tell them is accurate sources, that's not credible sources. That's not scholarly research. It's best to not deal with these really divisive issues. And by really divisive issues, I'm talking about things like legalization of drugs, abortion, toxic masculinity. There are avenues and venues to discuss those topics and places where you can discuss those topics in a rational and meaningful and tolerant fashion. But a composition essay often runs the risk of creating issues. And the one thing I will say is if you assume the wrong viewpoint in a paper, then that's more dangerous in some ways than assuming the right. And why take the risk, there are faculty members, and just being blunt, as a faculty member, there are faculty members that will take offense, and it will season the way they look at your paper if you take a position that they find particularly abhorrent. So you need to keep that in mind. It's better just to avoid those things if you can, unless you're in a position where you can't and you understand that there's potential for offense. And that gets to the last thing to avoid: assumptions. So if you are in a physical classroom with a group of students around you as you're watching this video with headphones on, or in a room where you can see other people, or next time you're in a room where you can see other people, we live in an immensely diverse, multicultural society. There is no single person that has the exact same experiences or worldview as you. Even if there's things we share and agree and have experienced, we often experience those things in completely different ways. So if we start from assuming our teacher has the same experiences or worldview as us, our peers have the same, our audience has the same worldview as us, then we're going to inevitably have issues with our topic. So you narrow your topic. You pick something that's debatable, that has multiple viewpoints based on your reading. You look for repetition in your notes from your reading. That is where your topic comes from. But keep in mind that if the topic is something that is rooted in an idea that you assume to be true based on your experiences, you either have to work to undermine that assumption and find evidence that's contrary to that assumption, or you need to pick a topic that you have less assumptions about. And this goes back to those divisive issues in politics or religious and spiritual arguments. Basically, if you believe something so much that somebody presenting evidence contrary to that belief is going to affect you in an extremely emotional way, it's best to just avoid it. There are lots of people, once they are ready and mature enough, that can face challenges to their faith or challenges to their beliefs and still come out with those beliefs, or come out with a broader perspective. And they grow through those challenges. And that is a good thing. And there are times you'll have faculty members in college, especially in the humanities, and read texts that really challenge your beliefs. But when you are developing a topic for a paper, I hate to put it this way, but I counsel safety and conservatism in topic selection. If you think that you might anger your reader, don't. That's the best advice I can give. And if you are going to take that risk, because in some ways those sorts of writings are much more interesting, if you are going to take those risks, I don't mind if you do, but make sure whatever positions you take in your arguments are supported by credible evidence, which is, again, another video we can talk about. So if you're going to go to these things that I'm telling you to avoid, you can do that. See, that's another thing with writing in the humanities I want to make very clear here. Hopefully you've watched to the end of this video because it is a long video. But this fact is so important. Many of our rules in composition classes are more guidance than law. That means they're conventions, they're things that are culturally determined and determined by the time period. Right down to formatting. Formatting is largely an issue that came about through the widespread use of word processing and Microsoft Office and that sort of thing. So I guess what I'm saying is rules are meant to be broken, but if you're going to break the rules, make sure you do them in a way that is successful and you know how to follow them first. And the only way to deal with or talk about any of these issues as a topic is to do so in a way that is rational and uses credible evidence. Okay, so that's all I have in this video. You can always email me for questions. Again, depending on the institution, my email is going to change. I hope you found this educational, and I can't wait to see most of you in class.